Welcome back to part 3 of the Precession series. Now, in part 1, we looked at the problems of precession, and in part 2, we showcased Jim's model for explaining the perceived motion that we call precession. Now, part 3 is really some of the raw excerpts from the conversation that I had with Jim in order to build that framework in my mind so that I understand his model enough so that I could make the video. Now, obviously, this is a more sort of long-winded conversation, and I was able to then distill that down into the 20-minute video, which is part 2. But I think it's important, if you're interested in this model, that you hear the more detailed explanation. And in particular, because we go into a little bit more detail about the constellations, we talk about the origins of Birkeland currents and Z pinches and some of the issues around that, understanding how that event occurred in the chimney and likening the process to hurricanes and sunspots. So there's a lot more detail in there. It just wasn't all relevant to the concept, which was part 2. So I would say enjoy it. It is a more sort of freestyle conversation rather than a sort of showpiece showing off his work. And don't forget that we are going to be doing a question and answer session with Jim. So if you have particular questions, queries, things you're not sure about, things you think actually may not work in this model, then please drop them down in the comments below. And we'll pick some of the best questions to put to Jim in a question and answer session. But for now, enjoy the raw conversation with Jim. So in my head, the way I sort of constructed it, I see if we were to take the hole that you would create, the larger Birkeland current, is that there are many strands that run along that. I guess a bit like the way they make big industrial wires that are twists within twists within twists, and that we are part of one of those strands, of which the center would be around, I guess, where the Pleiades is, and that our path, if you were to draw it, would be a spiral within our Birkeland current, but it itself spirals around the bigger filament. So overall, we would do a much larger rotation. Is that sort of the idea?
Right. Yeah. The general logic for it is that even the mainstream knows that, like on the scale of star-forming clouds, that they kind of flow along the background magnetic field. But in the mainstream view, those are mostly frozen-in magnetic fields. But if we accept that those are just from larger-scale currents, you kind of see that the logic of it is that a large-scale electric current has a Bessel function field, and then that kind of becomes the background field for the smaller scale filaments. So we can have smaller scale filaments that flow axially or azimuthally or helically around that larger scale filament, and that works basically all the way down.
You also talked about the fact that so we orbit. So from when you first started to look at this problem, you realized that if you looked at Sirius and our motion relative to Sirius, that in fact we were jointly orbiting around the center of Pleiades. But you also then mentioned that in fact we orbit around Arcturus, and that then orbits around Pleiades. Is that right?
Yeah, no, this is where I had a little bit of a, more esoteric and mythological knowledge that I was actually trying to debunk, because I had the mainstream ideas of gravity only. But what I could already see is weird patterns, like with star streams that were moving in ways that couldn't be explained gravitationally, but you could still map them out. For example, that belt of stars around the local chimney, even the mainstream sees that there is. They've isolated that as a group of stars rotating as a ring, and then they're just at a loss to explain it. But I had access to all that information of how these star motions are going, and I could see kind of patterns then in what was moving around what, and what I could calculate orbital periods based on if we assume these centers, and sure enough, those periods started matching in what we were looking for in extinction events and things like that. I was basically just without a mechanism until the EU ideas. It could explain that where gravity can't explain those.
But one of the things you said is that we orbit around Arcturus first and then around the Pleiades. So would that be, because I found it difficult to find an image that shows me where Arcturus is in relation to the Sun and then in relation to the Pleiades. I mean, is the idea that we orbit around Arcturus because that effectively is our local filament? So we are maybe Arcturus sits more in the center of that filament and we're on the outer edge, or
right,
is there
there is that stream of stars, like if called the Arcturus stream. There's like some 50 stars in that stream, and they're all noted for that quite strange high velocity across the sky, and that's what allowed the mainstream to identify that as a stream. But Arcturus turns out to be about the closest point on that stream to us, where it's crossing the sky. So I would suspect, even though that part I can't prove, I would suspect that filament is what we're spiraling around more, like for the toroidal path.
And I don't know if you're familiar with those, the diagram, but I'm assuming that the loops are actually showing some of those star streams that you're referring to. It certainly has the Gould belt, which is the much bigger, fainter blue.
Right. That's a lot of the information is actually in there, just with the mainstream articles referring to those features anyhow.
Yeah, but so where would Arcturus sit on this diagram? I mean, I don't need an exact, but I mean, are we talking? Because I struggle to find where it was on any of these maps, because I guess it's too far away to be on the local. Because the one with Sirius, it's not on there.
Right, and in the local chimney, it's in there, but it's so close to the sun, and Arcturus is very close. But yet it's out of the field of view in most of the local interstellar cloud images. But there is an image of the local interstellar cloud that shows the star Altair ahead of us, and you see that the cloud kind of curves towards that. Well, it turns out that the star Altair and the sun are equidistant from Arcturus. That was one thing I stumbled on even my mainstream days, is that was very bizarre that there's this equal spacing of us to that, like we're traveling around almost in a ring around that Arcturus star.
Right.
That was before I saw that as a in terms of a stream, like that it was, you can't explain that gravitationally, because Arcturus has a mass about equal to the sun, and even worse, there's more local stars that are more massive, like Sirius is way more massive and way closer, so it would be hard to make Arcturus matter. But once you see that is just part of a huge stream that happens to be just the closest point on a stream, then that our stream of stars curves around that, it makes more sense in the EU model already at that point.
Yeah, that makes sense to me as well, because that's, for me, is when I started to put all the bits together, is when I started to see it as filaments within filaments, and they're all spiraling around each other and then spiraling around the bigger one. So that's how you end up with this almost like a constant turning motion, but then also a much larger, longer scale motion, which I guess somehow looks like an orbit, but obviously it's still following a spiral pattern.
Right, like with the scale of the local interstellar cloud, and there's a G cloud, and the mainstream thinks there might be a couple other filamentary clouds. All of those are kind of squished together in a cylindrical surface that they think is another giant like shock front. But basically, all these little small scale filaments make up apparently a shell of, we wouldn't say shock fronts, we'd say an even larger scale filament. So in other words, like this huge filament comes down, you get Markland convection and stuff, and within these shells, now you can form smaller scale filaments. And again, just it really is that logic of seeing that why that has to happen, and that if a current filament sorts charged material into shells, all flowing according to the same direction in that shell, that's where you get current filaments to form in the first place, is when you have a lot of charge following along the background magnetic field. And so you see the logic of how you just build up current filaments on every scale that way, just out of each filament. But each one must match then either directly it must match the larger scale filament, or it could be spiraling with another filament around that background magnetic field of the larger filament.
Yeah, it follows the main direction. So whatever that main Birkeland current, where it originally originated from, it would follow that path. But obviously within it, its path might be more complex, but overall it would still follow that same magnetic field which the original one generated.
Right. And see here, I've got a few of the scales mapped out, and you can see how you might lose it on one scale, and you could still pick up, even if you have you're missing a scale, you can still pick up where you left off and follow it up and down. So the part that's easiest to see is we know that current galaxies seem to be strung on really large scale filaments, and those filaments should have a radial electric field themselves, so that you can all of a sudden explain why current should flow along the spiral arms of a galaxy. But then that scale, the spiral arms should have a Bessel function field, and that should leave smaller scale currents flowing along the arms or around the arms. And there's mainstream evidence of streams of material on those scales. Now, what I would argue is that the local chimney is where one of those helical fields around the arm crosses through the galactic plane. It would be coming downward and inward towards the galactic center, and that matches the orientation of what's happening for the local chimney. We would be just catching it on the scale where it crosses through the galactic plane. And then that's where you could see that clearly that structure is a pinch. And then I jumped down to what's clearly marked out is that the local interstellar cloud shows all the evidence of being a smaller scale Birkeland current. But I know that I'm missing the mapping out exactly of one of the in-between scales, simply because the mainstream even now is still mapping out all these stellar streams. And we really need to see that all of those are Birkeland currents, and that even now they are doing a good job of pinning the actual motions and of each of these streams to map out which stars are in which streams. In a perfect world, I would have all that information already, and then we would have the Birkeland currents on that scale mapped out. So I'm basically missing. The mainstream has lots of evidence for these star-forming filaments of about a few tenths of a light year wide. There's enough evidence that those are Birkeland currents, and we know how those are mapped very locally. but then I'm missing this, how these streams fit exactly into the larger scale chimney.
Yeah,
but interesting, since the mythological data was right about, or esoteric data was right about those other two scales. For example, it's very easy to see where the Pleiades fits in that chimney, and that we must be bound to that too. We must be spiraling around that. And if they were right about that, what they are, in the same mythology, it tells us that our precessional axis is related to our motion, and then you can see which way our filament has to spiral in the future.
Which is?
Well, see there, the problem that we're having in mapping out the rate of precession is, we think, based on the gravitational model, we think it's just somehow speeding up, that it's going in a circle, but it's circling at a faster rate. But there is another idea in that it could be going at a constant rate around an axis, but that whole axis itself is drifting over time, which is what would happen if it's caused by a toroidal motion of the sun. In other words, if we were just spiraling along helically, that would keep stars spiraling around in a circle in the sky along the direction, relative to our motion. But if we're also arcing across the sky, not just a helical path, but like in a toroidal path, then sometimes that precessional motion would work with that drift and sometimes against it. So in other words, I'm going to argue that precession is actually going on at a much more constant rate than they calculate, because they're seeing two motions superimposed. They're seeing this nice clockwork precessional cycle, like the mythology says happens, like the Yuga cycles say happens on this scale, but that it goes with this longer term curving, so that it makes when both are moving in the same direction, the pole appears to move faster, and when one's working against the other one, it moves slower. It's kind of like that Draco tracing out that snake. If you make constant circling with your hand, hold your hand out, make a constant rate circle, but the whole time move your arm slowly to the left, you see that sometimes your finger moves faster and then slower and faster and slower. Sorry about that.
That's all right. Right. So normal precession is just us following the helical path around and around. So doing a normal circle, if you were to look down the Birkeland current through the axis. But in fact, what we're doing is, because we're talking a Bessel function, it is curving as well. So therefore we are effectively at this point, as you say, circling upwards. So the spiral is having to move upwards, and then at some stage, maybe in the future, it might then curl downwards. But you're saying that movement, because we're sort of moving upwards, there is an additional upward motion, which then we curve downwards, and then obviously we're a little bit further up, and then that adds extra movement to the background stars, which deceives you into thinking that it's speeding up, when in fact it is the motion that is changing the way the background stars move.
Right.
I mean, it's elegant, it's simple, and it's so much. I mean, it's not simple to understand. You have to see it, but it's simple in terms of it doesn't require an equation that doesn't mean anything. It is all to do with a motion of a very simple pattern, and that has elegant beauty in itself. If we go back to the Gould belt, because and the fact that you talk about the pinch, I kind of put two and two together in what I sort of put down there, and I'm not entirely sure whether that was indeed the sort of thing that you were talking about. But when I did some research on the Gould belt, it's not as old as I had originally thought it was. So is it possible that the pinch that we see in terms of the local chimney at some event caused the Gould belt to form as a sort of a torus that expanded outward from that initial pinch point, and at that point when that occurred, that obviously would have kind of lit that whole structure up, and that is where potentially, if you were to look at the sky, you would see the stick man glowing, because you have part of the torus, which is the expanding stars, and then you have the pinched Birkeland current coming down through the chimney as we see it. I mean, am I like a million miles off thinking that?
No, that's right, and that gives you exactly the right reference frame. That would put us in the plane of that belt of stars, meaning in the plane of that plasma torus. And the ancient depictions many of them are clearly from that vantage point of seeing this axis of discharge across the sky and being in the plane of the torus, but just outside of it at that point. So that's definitely the right vantage point for that structure in an earlier time.
Is that also, because I did actually find, I didn't know this, but I actually have a copy of Hamlet's Mill. I went to buy it, and then Amazon told me, you already purchased this back in 1999. So I was like, really? So I had to go and find it, and I found it. I haven't had a chance to read it in depth, but I did scan through while I looked up the whirlpool references in there. And because you talked about the fact that the from some of the notions in Hamlet's Mill, that the idea of the whirlpool refers to this expanding sort of torus.
Right.
Is that all then related in your mind to this event that occurred that created the Gould belt?
Right. That there's this stories in there go to at least both of the scales of that local chimney, and as well as our precession is, if you accept that it's due to the spiraling of our smaller scale helical spiraling in 24,000-ish years, then that mythology goes with that scale too. But they're giving you all this information on multiple scales, whereas some cultures preserve different pieces of that, like in the Eastern tradition with the Yuga cycle and the longer cycle, they tell you specifically those two, that one is the precessional cycle, and then the other one is the longer term cycling in as many millions of years as the precessional cycle is in thousands of years, for example. So that would be the orbital period around the Pleiades, or our motion around the local chimney axis. So they had both of those, and they knew the significance of those for their effects on us too. But yeah, Hamlet's Mill, if people were only going to read one work, and the first piece that I got from that, the most significant piece, was actually from a question, and I actually stumbled on the right answer. The question that came up in Hamlet's Mill was like why constellations were drawn, only half of the constellation, repeatedly in figures. For example, Taurus, the bull, had shoulders, head, and horns, but no back of the bull. Pegasus, the same. With Argo, it was a ship, but it was only the stern of the ship, and then they kind of lost track of what happened. But the important thing in the story of Argo is that it's being drawn stern first. Now, I should have already come to the conclusion, but I actually, when I was going to find a book on the mythology, more of the mythology, I stumbled on a children's book out in the front of the bookstore, and it was a book about a little speeding engine. And they did the same thing. They had a drawing of the front of an engine that just kind of trailed off. And I realized that's what they're trying to convey. The only way you can convey in a fixed image any kind of motion, if that's what you're trying to convey, is that you draw the front half of it in the direction it's moving and not the back. And where I knew that was the right way to look at it was, like I say, with the Argo, the ship, where they only drew the back part of the ship, but they said the ship was being dragged stern first. So that key piece of information, once you get that these aren't stick figures, that they're not telling us how stars are look in the sky. There's no reason to draw those shapes that way. Plus, the stories are way too complex to go with those drawings. But once you see that they're trying to map out for you the long-term motions and show you not how things appear now, but which way they're spiraling, and that's the key to mapping all that out. And then you see that all of it, rather than being isolated pieces, sometimes they're different views of the same thing. Like I was saying, of Draco at the North Pole being almost a mirror image, but not quite, of Argo, the ship, rowing in one direction, but being dragged stern first. Those are both like circles superimposed on a drift of motion off to the side, but in opposite directions. And they both happen to match the same. If you are in a toroidal motion with other stars, those are the paths that those stars would trace out in that direction in the sky. So it's like basically giving you the bigger picture of how everything is moving. And once I had that, then the rest is like you just see that, well, they're saying, like, then when you see how many precessional cycles, you actually can, basically you can even see how to put the pieces together.
It's mind-blowing, the fact that, I mean, if it's true that they knew this, it's phenomenal, because that is a level of understanding which, well, I mean, we don't even have it. And we're talking, in order to know this, I mean, you either have to be observing it for long enough to see that motion, or you have to understand how it works.
Right,
both
one
of which,
or the other. Right.
Yeah, both of which.
Either way.
Yeah, it's truly baffling. Just
but
coming back.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go on.
I was going to say the most important thing is why, if you were trying to convey knowledge to the future, why that would be so important. If there are these long-term cycles, so that it means they really wanted us to know that more than anything. But that's where, like in the Eastern knowledge, it associates the precessional cycle with the rise and fall of civilizations on the same time period, and this fall into darkness and coming out of it. That all of a sudden becomes, if you're willing to believe that part of it, you see why the preoccupation with sharing that knowledge in the future. Otherwise, it's just, so what, stars move this way and we know it. That isn't even as impressive as why those cycles matter. But then when you look at that longer term spiraling that we do around the Pleiades, that matches the period of an even harder mass extinction cycle that the mainstream is looking for, this 26 to 27 million year nemesis cycle. Again, if someone knew the significance of that, obviously that would be something important that you would want to convey.
But my question when I look at that is if the catastrophe cycle is linked to that motion, that implies that at some point in our orbit around the larger Birkeland current, that we must encounter something regularly at the moment, which either disrupts the field, or it's a giant, I don't know, dust cloud, or because when I look at the kind of more zoomed out one, the one that I sent you in the chat, it's difficult to see, although you can't. It's really hard to say what the size of the Birkeland current would be, but where would our motion cause us to intersect something which could cause that? Because when I look at it, I see patchiness, I see like clumps of clouds, and obviously some of those probably will be moving with the Birkeland current as well. So yeah, my question is, why wouldn't it be more often than 26 million? Because 26 million implies that there is something fixed that we go through.
Right. And well, interestingly, we do, because our orbit would be inclined to the galactic plane. We have to cross through the plane, although that would be twice in the orbit. But one of the extinction cycles, the most recent one, did seem to match where we'd be crossing through the plane on the other half of the, like, not our most recent passage up through the plane, but where we would have crossed down through the plane on the other side. So that part, to me, I would like to actually trace our orbit back and actually see if you could see anything that at that distance. But on the smaller cycle, with the precessional cycle, and this is like what those at like the Binary Research Institute and were into, is matching the Eastern mythology to or religious tradition to this precessional cycle. And what they got out of it, what like Walter Cruttenden, he was the one that said that yes, it says that this precessional cycle is caused by the sun's motion due to some other star, but they wanted to make it a binary orbit. But the point was that we get closer and farther from some source of magnetism, and that is what causes this advance and retardation in our knowledge. And now what's interesting about that is that even the EU biologist types are realizing that you see links to like spurts of human intelligence or even brain size that might be linked to magnetic field, increasing magnetic field strength based on what they see in layers in the ground. So they're starting to notice this pattern where electricity and magnetism can be used to accelerate electric fields, can increase neuron growth, and magnetism might have an effect on brain size. So you can kind of see that there is a pattern to that makes sense.
Yeah, and I guess if we think about the fact that we are part of a multi-structure system, then it is quite possible that as we move around our helix, as we move more towards the center, the magnetic fields might indeed be much, much stronger, so that there could...
Right. See, they have to. That's the difference in the binary idea, that we're in a gravitational binary orbit. Yes, we might go closer and farther to some magnetic center out there. But if you accept that we are spiraling along on a helical or toroidal path, it doesn't matter. That's following a background magnetic field. Well, that means that background magnetic field, if we're going to say that's caused by another current and not just some frozen in field lines, that means the source of that magnetism has to be our background magnetic field is wrapped around that. In other words, in our helicals or toroidal spiraling, we have to go closer and farther from the source of that magnetic field. So there's like no getting around it. The EU theory actually requires that. If we're spiraling around a background magnetic field line, the source of that magnetism is off to the side of that, obviously, curved, and we have to go closer and farther from that magnetic field. So that to me that's where I'd like to go in the future. That's putting lots of pieces together of ideas that are still right now individually crazy. Like some people are totally unaware of any links to brain size and the magnetic field that seems to be recorded in the geology part and so on. There's like a lot of outside the box astronomy and biology that you would have to accept and obviously dating of human civilization. So we'd have to kind of throw all that out the window. But I do see a very coherent picture out of all this. To me, it seems, having read all these different things, and that's why when people express an opinion that you don't really have to read a lot, or they prefer not to read a lot, that's really my only strength in that. I'm not a brain any more than, probably less than most of the people in the EU community or the CPAC community. I just have read everything that they have and what the mainstream, and that's where you get where all of a sudden things, even if I could never have thought of any of these theories on my own, I see everybody else's theory and how they work so well together to get you all of a sudden
that's kind of the way I see it as well. It's about finding the connections between the dots that you see. So I think it's the only way to do it. Sometimes some of the people who are so smart are so stuck in their model that they can't see the rest of it around there, and it's your ability to be able to kind of step back and look at that bigger picture and be brave enough to throw some of the ideas like civilization, how old it is, out the window and say, well, but what if this was true? And the implications are just, astounding, truly. Yeah, wow, is all I would say. I want to make sure that it's very clear that it's your idea. The fact is that obviously, Birkeland current is not your idea, but it's your idea of bringing all of these things together to explain everything in this elegant, simplistic thing. I can't think of the word for the thing.
Right. Yeah, I don't know either. Yeah, that's really what I like. I just feel like I was really lucky myself to have. I have like more mainstream credits under my belt than almost anybody I know. And I was lucky enough to stumble into the CPAC stuff with, got to meet Robert Schock and Walter Cruttenden. I also got to go to Thunderbolt's conferences. That's really it. It's just that I being at the right place at the right time to put those different pieces together to see what the mainstream evidence, be able to read what that actually says compared to what they say it says, but mostly put the EU ideas of, electric universe ideas with the CPAC ideas of this cycles on different scales having to do with the motion of our sun, which that's the part they had right. They were just missing. It's almost like anybody in my position that had the CPAC background and the EU background, I bet would get to the same point I did if they had just those two pieces down.
But I think that a combination of those two is an unusual combination, and I think that makes you unique, because I think most people sit in one camp or sit in the other camp, and there are those that kind of stray between the two, but for someone who's come from mainstream to go to CPAC to effectively try and discredit it, and then to discover the EU, is a fairly unique combination, I think.
Yeah, just being in the right place at the.
That's the universe, isn't it? Though sometimes those things just happen, and you just have to smile and just go, "Yeah, okay, I'm gonna run with it."
Right, and then I have like this drive to share that with people that weren't able to do that just because of just life situations. Really been very fortunate to be able to go to school that long and go to conferences, and when a lot of people are just so bogged down with the daily grind.
Yeah. One question, which is not necessarily related to this theory, But if we assume that these Birkeland currents are flowing, one of the biggest questions I have is what is the direction of that flow? Because I think in Wohl's theory, they flow outwards from the galactic center, outwards along the spiral arm. Am I right in thinking that?
Well, I think in one of his drawings, he had the current actually going inward along the arm.
See, that makes more sense to me. For me, the current going inwards makes a lot more sense, because if I look at Alvan's galactic circuit, then they have to be closed loop. So it has to go out at the top and then up and around. And then in my mind, it would come along the galactic arm and then into the center. And
see, that's something that was in the Thunderbolts forum, because I read that too. They were having that argument over which circuit to use, and there's actually a thread just on trying to combine a couple of the circuits, and I think that's the key, and that's more obvious not at the galactic or solar system scale, but when we look at like hurricanes or sunspots, you see that although the same pattern shows up on the scale of the local chimney, where these pinches don't just happen at random, and the torus doesn't form out of nothing. In the case of the local chimney, that torus of material is centered in the galactic plane. It's where that current crosses through the galactic plane. But all of that makes sense if you realize that, yes, there is a current flowing, in the case of a sunspot, right up and down through the sun. It's not totally recirculating. It can be a discharge from the sun to somewhere else. Or in the case of a hurricane, there can be a discharge from Earth out into space. But there's still going to be current, since that current filament, according to Don Scott, has a radial electric field. Then where that passes through a plane of charged material, you can see how that then sets up the current in there. That the radial electric field of this current that's penetrating like a charged double layer, or in the case, I know I'm jumping around here a lot. I'll stick on one topic. Okay.
No, it's fine.
Let's say there's a hurricane is really formed, like Don Scott was trying to argue for, an electric current centered right at the eye of the hurricane. Well, that makes sense, because that has that current should have a radial electric field. So when that passes through, we know clouds are charged by layer, like more negatively charged at one and positively charged. Then this Birkeland current flowing up and down through that should make the negatively charged layer move radially in one direction and the positively charged radially in another direction. And you can almost see how this toroid gets started then just by that. And when you look at sunspots, you see the same kind of rotation. With a sunspot, we're looking down on the top from that, and we see material. If you've ever seen those like time-elapsed,
yes, it looks like they're falling in. It looks
falling in.
Yes.
And then it might be out on the bottom, though. We lose track of it.
Yes.
But in a hurricane, when we're looking at it from the bottom, we know that there's an outward flow of wind at the bottom layer of that. And obviously the air that's coming out there doesn't get created. It's sucked in at the top, and it's kind of the same structure. It's where a current comes down through double layers, and it sets up the opposite flow in the radial flow in the positive layer that it would in the negative layer, and there you have the basis for those structures basically, and the flow that we see. And to me, that's the trick.
So you're talking about the Birkeland current intersecting the galactic plane, and that intersection causes the pinching effect that we see in the local chimney, and thereby produces the Gould belt expanding outwards. That event,
right,
like a hurricane, drawing the matter sort of Well,
Right.
it's pinching the plasma filament, and that which then pushes the material out from the plane of where the pinch is, which then forms the toroid. That's what you're saying, right?
Right. And see that really when you think about that, then the toroid itself is almost like that's kind of like a current loop, which also has like you can think of that as having a Bessel function field, or Markland convection, which means it should drive stuff out of the torus, but that also means pressure inward towards, you see the mechanics for the pinch in that original current just from that. And that's where I still want to get people in the EU community focus more on pinches. There was that idea that a pinch, I don't know if you've read that before, I know it's kind of off topic for this, but they never revised the model of the pinch from that first Birkeland current idea where the magnetic field was wrapped around. So the idea that even stands in the EU community for a pinch is that it must be the balance of pressure from with the charge being pushed along the current from the charge being pushed inward. Well, why do you need pressure to push current along a filament? Well, if the magnetic field is wrapped around it as smoothly everywhere, like the field around a wire, then yes, you need something to get the charge to flow across those magnetic field lines. But in a Bessel function filament, you can have current along the filament without it crossing the field line. So right away, that's good. That's what they've got modeled. And all of a sudden, you can have a minimum energy configuration with almost no force required to sustain these currents, which is what we're going to need to explain how currents stay so consistent for long periods without losses in space.
Yeah.
But then the problem is you have to go back. If you don't have the model for that filament, right, when you're talking about how Z-pinches form, you clearly aren't going to have that modeled right. So right away, you take away that if there's no pressure required to get current to move along the filament, then how can the Z-pinch be a balance of pressure pushing in as opposed to, they've got it all wrong. But what they should have done is, in a perfect world, we would have had, Don Scott, or, he said, as he showed, that wasn't a new idea. Lundquist discovered it first, and then it kind of fell by the wayside, where Don just grabbed it, made it more publicly known, and worked with it from there. But in a perfect world, we would have all had Bessel function filaments before we even tried to explain how a solar system would form in one, or how a Z-pinch would form in. You see the idea? If you don't even know that they have a radial electric field, or or the charge can flow along them without crossing field lines. If you don't have that right, but science doesn't work that way. You get things when you get them. You don't.
Yeah,
and it's kind
sometimes
it gives you sympathy for the mainstream though, when you kind of judge them for a patchwork ideas, like that they wouldn't have come up with dark matter had they already understood other issues first, but they were already so solidly in the gravity only model that then you end up with those kind of patches. And I could see how EU might do the same thing if we don't go back and fix that early.
Yeah, well, we're all human, aren't we? And we
Right.
tend to get stuck in those sort of, this is the one, and I must make this work.
Mm-hmm.
So in my idea, for the galactic circuit is and the reason I ask about their direction is, I would see the galaxies as being like giant engines, and at some stage, if those stars are moving towards the center, then at some stage they have to be almost like regurgitated and pushed out again, and then the formation starts. So in the way I kind of see it is the formation of stars starts from outwards in. So you have more plasma at the outer edges as it kind of circles back round to the galactic plane, Then you have stars forming, which then slowly drift towards the center. And then you have whatever our galactic engine is, whether it's a plasmoid or whatever it is, which churns all of this sort of round. That's kind of the way I starting to see some of this based on some of these ideas. But I don't know whether I'm, a billion miles off the mark.
Yeah, that's the right way. Yeah, like once you see where the individual stars fit in, that they're almost completely divorced from the large scale filament along the arm, and they form within even smaller scale filaments, which means that they can be more likely spiraling, around the arms, up and down through the galactic plane, things that we see stars doing. But
that would imply, if the current flows from out to in, that the further in you go, that the older the stars would be.
Yeah, if it depends what time scales stars.
I suppose you could still have new ones forming along the chain further along,
right.
But
because remember, that whole mainstream idea is wrong too about blue stars and red stars necessarily being, younger and older.
Yeah, no, I did a piece on that. Was it 2 weeks ago or something like that? But looking at the, there was an article about the moon and the way they'd detected from the samples on the moon that the sun, when it was younger, rotated slow, because obviously we don't know our sun rotates relatively slow compared to other stars. So I did some research on spin rates of stars and that compared to mass, and all of it is dependent on the notion that when we look at a star that we know its age from the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram.
Right.
And yet if you throw that out the window, then all of that becomes just it's just a random thing. The spin of the star could equally depend on the incoming current, which would then affect the color of the star and where we would put it, or where mainstream would put it, on the Hertzsprung-Russell. So it unravels so many things for them, but
right.
Yet it allows you to look at it in a completely different way from mainstream.
Right. And that gives you so many ideas, though, on things like some of their evidence that those stars are older is that, they're more metals compared to, more iron to helium, for example. But that means if the color really is reversible, and ancient records say it was, and EU theory says it should be, that means that metallicities even have to be reversible. And that shouldn't be surprising, that we might live in a universe where fission and fusion reactions can run in either direction and in the right, in the right electrical environments. But that means that has to be going on too, because so that's like kind of a fascinating thing to me.
It is. Right. Well, thank you very much for your time, Jim. And I will ping you some stuff across this week, and then once I get to sort of the first draft of the video, I'll ping that across to you so you can have a look at it as well and just give me some feedback on it.
Okay, that sounds good.
Cool. Thank you very much, Jim. I hope you found that an interesting discussion with Jim. Please don't forget that if you have questions about this model, stick them down in the comments below, and we'll cover that in the question and answer session that we do with Jim. Time frame for that, it really depends on how many questions we get. I'm hoping to get that done within the next week or two. So whether the question and answer comes out the week after this, or it may well be the week after that. It just depends on times and whether we can align our schedule to organize the call. But as always, be brave, be curious. The truth is waiting for us. Until next time.